going to talk about composing, which is much broader than simply writing. Too often, when people talk about writing, they think of it in terms of just paper and pencil. And in today's digital society, we really need to think of writing as more multimodal, multimedia. So, let me talk a little bit about traditional writing. A couple of things. First off, I think that writing has most often been assigned and not taught. And too often, teachers don't write with their children. So let me describe what has been a traditional approach to writing, and then later on in the vodcast, we'll talk about how writing has changed and how it needs to change further. Traditionally, kids have been asked to brainstorm, and they might do that by making a concept map, writing down some ideas that they have, and just begin writing. And the next thing that they're asked to do typically is to draft, and that's just to get their ideas down. There's very little done with pre-planning. Sometimes teachers address that and sometimes they don't. And then kids are asked to edit. And within the editing phase, often revision and actually editing for surface concerns like punctuation, grammar, spelling, and so forth are blended together, and kids often only focus on the surface issues of spelling and so forth. And then there's a final copy. My suspicion is that many teachers don't write with their children and don't model how to do it, and that's why they're unclear what they can do. So kids who like to write a lot and get better at writing, and kids who don't like to write tend to avoid it and tend not to make the progress that we'd like. Let's talk about composing today. It's really more multimedia. We should expect that children will want to include audio at times, visual images at times, and so forth. And it's much less linear. Sometimes students start with the pictures that they've taken and write from that. But it's really more about revisioning, thinking about what they want to communicate and how best to do that. It would be best to do that through a series of pictures with very limited text and some music. It would be better to do it in the format of a written editorial. And so there's much more awareness of audience and thinking about who will be reading it and for what purposes. It's no longer just the student and the teacher, and many times writing is collaborative. So many lessons, which I'll talk about later, and I also have talked about in quite a bit of detail in the podcast on the writing process, may look at technology aspects. You may teach children how to use particular features of a word program or how to develop PowerPoints that are really effective. And they'll also look at craft. How do you teach kids the kinds of skills that writers actually use so that they can try it out in their own writing? And of course, along with that, you'll be looking at mentor text. That is text students are highly familiar with. They can go back through and look at with a writer's eye to look at how did the writer of this particular text approach that topic. To me, one of the most important aspects of developing kids who want to write and kids who are really good in their composing is modeling. And so that's where it becomes really important that as teachers, we share many lessons, that we show pieces of our writing, that we ask children's permission and showcase pieces of their writing, that we do shared writing together, whether that's going to be composing a PowerPoint or whatnot, so that we can talk through the thinking process, have kids actively engage and sharing the space and the work with us. And of course, mentor texts. So finding texts that really are beautifully written, that speak to kids, that have power for kids, will be a critical component in part of the modeling. So let me show you an example. I have this book on my bookshelf. I like Mercer Mayer. He often uses repetitive phrases. For example, there's a book called Just Me and My Dad, and that phrase, just me and my dad, comes through it again and again and again. So I'm going to show you a few pages and kind of illustrate the repetitive phrase. And the title is If I Had a Gorilla. If I had a gorilla, I'd take him to school. Then the big kids wouldn't pick on me. If I had a gorilla. So if I had a gorilla starts the thought and ends the thought. And then he goes on and uses it similarly with if I had an alligator, I'd feed him fresh fish so he would be my friend. Then the big kids wouldn't duck me when I was swimming. You can see how he uses the then the whatever. If I had an alligator. Imagine kids thinking about issues in their own life that bother them and how they might use something to address that particular issue. So they're actually using, probably going to try on the phrase of, if I had a whatever, then blah, 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 if I had a whatever. So I can actually develop a lens and look at how the writer has written it and think about applying it to their own writing. I want to give you some background on the connections between reading and writing. You may know some of this, you may not be aware of this. I will tell you straightforward, poor readers are always poor writers and always poor spellers. More likely poor spellers than poor writers, because kids who have trouble reading often have trouble with decoding, so we shouldn't be surprised to find they also struggle with encoding. But not all poor spellers are poor writers. Sometimes students have just not picked up the phonic elements, so we need to give them strategies for how they can address it. Certainly using Word with spell check becomes critically important. So let me talk about what struggling readers most often look at: surface issues. They try to fix the spelling. If they can't fix the spelling, they pick an easier word. So instead of magnificent, they might try beautiful. They can't spell beautiful, so they write nice. So it actually dummies down and takes the power away from what they want to say. Most often, they don't focus on content. They think what's most important, and we know this from research, is that the writing is neat, that there aren't any spelling errors, and that it has the number of words that the teacher talks about. And very rarely do poor writers think about their message and think about, do I need to say this another way? Do I need to have a different vision so that it's very clear? And I think that's because most of the feedback they get has to do with their poor spelling, their noun verb disagreement, dangling participles, and so forth. It's not to deny that those aren't important, but first the message has to be really clear. What do you want to say, and how do you want to say it? And that has to be the focus. And so kids have to live with a piece over time. Too often in schools, they just write a piece and that's it, they're done with it. So let me talk about why I think composing is so important. You know that I love the Web 2.0 tools. They give us so many opportunities for children to demonstrate understanding of communication in engaging ways. We live in a digital world. Our kids are going to enter a digital world. They need to understand how these tools might be used to effectively communicate. And we know that our kids are engaged all the time. When you look at that required video on schools that have changed for this module, you will see that one of the principals talks about how kids were texting and listening to music and doing all sorts of stuff and doing very little on the computer. So we know that it engages kids. We know that they expect to be engaged in those kinds of things outside of school. So we take that interest and some of those competencies and we bring them in the classroom. So composing is much more purposeful. Kids are actively learning. Kids are showing each other what they're doing, trying to get their message across with a real clear awareness of audience. I certainly know that when I was a child, I wrote only because my teacher told me I had to write and because it was going to be graded. So there are a lot of ways to get ideas for composing. Certainly life experiences is a great basis. We know that most writers write from their own experiences. So memoir writing is a superb way to start kids on writing. And also developing expert lists. And I'll talk about both of these more in the writing process MP3, which is uploaded. But expert lists are really where you identify those content areas that you know a lot about. For example, I know a lot about breast cancer as a breast cancer survivor. So that's something that I have an interest in, that I read about, that I keep up on, and I might be able to write about that. I'm also very interested in digital literacy, so that would be an area that I would describe myself as an expert. So working with your kids to find out what they know a lot about, maybe it's soccer, what they're really passionate about, maybe it has to do with hip-hop music, and allowing them to focus on those to learn the skills of writing that will then transfer into some of the other kinds of writings that you expect. Keeping a notebook is really important, and a notebook is where kids will journal. And it's also where I think it's important to have kids collect quotes, collect words, collect pictures, collect things that are of interest to them so that they can use them to begin to write. You know, there are some writers, for example, who scan the newspaper for interesting articles, and that's how they get ideas of what they want to write about. Also, many kids like kind of competitive things where they could win something, where they could have some opportunity. And so I just went on the internet yesterday and searched competitive writing opportunities and came up with something wonderful from Scholastic. I'm going to show you this just as an example. They have a new writing essay with kids in grades 4 to 8, and they can show how they use Jackie Robinson's life experiences in their own lessons. And they can win some wonderful prizes. They can go to a Major League All-Star game. They can get laptop computers for teachers and kids. So there's a real reason. There are a lot of information available so that you can learn about Jackie Robinson, but it provides a tremendous opportunity for kids to write for a purpose. And so this is just one example that I offer to you. Newspapers for your classroom also work really well. I assume that you're familiar with the readwritethink.org website, which is co-owned by IRA and NCTE, National Councils of Teachers of English, and the International Reading Association. And you can see on the right-hand part of this slide that you can develop a booklet, a newspaper, a flyer, or a brochure. And it's fairly straightforward. I started doing a little one just as an example. You'll see down there on the left-hand side where it says snow day, and children in Green School are counting the hours until snow arrives because there's an expected snow day. And of course, today we have, in Lake George anyway, gotten over a foot of snow. So essentially what kids do is fill in the blanks and then they can publish it. And there are many other programs on the web that allow you to use templates and produce something that looks very professional. And you could put this up on your blog or your school's website or your classroom website. So let me take an example that I pulled off the Scholastic website. And I really do like the Scholastic website and recommend it to you. And any website I mention, you'll find in the handout associated with this vodcast. So take a look at this article that Anthony wrote about the Yankees. Smash! There it goes, right out to home field. Home run! There goes the Sultan of Swat's 700th home run ball. July 13th, 1935 was one of the greatest days in MLB, Major League Baseball history. And he goes on to talk about it. And I'll give you just a minute to read it. Okay, I'm going to assume that you are done. But if you look at this carefully, you can see that he's got a great opening. Smash! There it goes, right out to right field. Home run! There goes the Sultan of Swat's 700th home run ball. Captures you, grabs you, and then goes on to talk about the day that it happened. He doesn't identify who hit that home run. I think it probably was Babe Ruth, but he doesn't tell us that, so it's certainly something you could conference about. Now, there are many surface areas, many issues you could focus on with this child, but I think you need to be really careful or you'll start teaching the child that editing the final component is what's important. And let me show you what I mean. Here are most of the mistakes. I didn't even mark them all, but most of the mistakes that he made. And so it's certainly not a perfect piece of writing. And most students, most adults alike, will not produce an absolutely perfect piece of writing. But let's talk about what we might look at. To me, it seems capitalization is something that you probably want to review with a child. Twice he's left it off proper names. 3 times he's left it off with the title. That really could be counted as one error. And the beginning of a sentence. I'm not terribly worried about the child knowing beginning of a sentence because you can see that he's demonstrated that he does have that correct in many cases. If we look at possessive, it looks as if there's only one point at which he really missed the possessive. And so that's probably not my priority unless I see that happening again and again. Compound word home run. It's a perfect opportunity for a child to have a word wall or a personal word page. For kids in the elementary school, I tend to use word walls and use them as manila file folders, and any word they want spelled I put on there. And sometimes it works best for kids to have them kind of in alphabetical order, so you write A through Z and leave spaces and write any word in there. Then they can just consult it when they need it. It's right there. They can open it up on their desk and look for a word that they misspell. And he clearly doesn't know that home run is a compound word. Now, if he were using this online in Word, it should come up with a green squiggly under it, letting him know that there's some mistake there. It may not, because home and run are also words, and I'm not sure about that. For older kids, I tend to say, open up a section of your writing journal and let's put in the words that you misspell all the time. All of us have words they struggle with. For example, I never seem to spell accommodate right. I put two C's, two M's, two D's. It always looks funny to me, and my Word corrects it because it knows I make that mistake all the time. I don't think about it. On the other hand, when I'm writing on the board in the classroom, I think carefully about how to spell accommodate if I'm putting that on the chalkboard for some reason. And when we get down to looking at dialect, it depends on the child's age. Most learners, until they're in about seventh grade, they can't back up and look at their own language pattern. So I'm not sure if this kid actually speaks like this. Roger Marist became one of the bests when he hit the magical number 61. Um, I don't know if he talks that way, I'd probably leave it alone. If he doesn't make that error in his speaking, then I might have a conversation when I conference with him. There's a lot of voice here, and I don't want the child to think that this isn't a good piece. This is, in fact, quite an interesting piece. It has a lot of potential. It just needs to be lived with over time a little more. There's also something I want to recommend to you, and that's Curriki and Writing Matters. They have some wonderful, wonderful units of study. So if you're thinking to yourself that you really want to teach kids how to respond to particular readings and writing, there's a unit on that. How to write a feature article, how to write memoir. And so there's a lot out there that can help you. And I really encourage you to take a look at thecurriki.org and Writing Matters, because you'll find a lot of helpful information on teaching writings to students. What's left out of it, however, is the use of technology. And that's where I think the next step has to come in our teaching. We know about how to teach writing. How do we teach kids to compose? That is, how do we embed the technology so that their final product is even. Comics are often underestimated. They're really very complex because you've got to take a visual image and with very limited text communicate a message. So that combining of graphic information and text is important. Certainly when I was a child, and probably when you were a child, people kind of looked down their nose at comics. They may have appreciated political cartoons in your history class, but it was not something that you ever studied. And yet in the real world of communication, comics and that combining of graphic and visual image is done all the time. So there are many educational implications. And I want to show you a wonderful example that Debbie Dermody's students developed. And you know her from that conversations with a teacher using digital literacy. And so here's an example where she's been using it to help kids develop their understanding of vocabulary. And here's a child, a fifth grader, who explains the word galvanized. It's very effective. They've used Toondoo, which is kind of fun, but there are several comic opportunities out there, and in some you can even insert kids' pages, and I've given you many of those before, but it's certainly an opportunity of something that you could do. So we don't typically think of comics as teaching vocabulary, but they certainly could. You could use comics to teach story structure, setting, initiating event, attempts, problems, resolution very quickly so kids understand that's the framework of a narrative story. We do have to focus on grammar and punctuation and spelling, but I don't think that we do that until we're really satisfied that our kids understand the writing process. And that's after they're done with their revision and they've made it as clear as they can, then we want to look at what's the major priority. You cannot fix absolutely everything, and that makes parents crazy. Sometimes teachers use stamps under construction. I think if a kid lives with a piece over time, you can show the way in which they have grown. But you fixing absolutely every single error in a piece of writing is probably not what you're going to do unless it's for some kind of very public publication. And so you need to think about targeted mini lessons. And mini lessons really are no longer than 10 minutes. You want to really limit yourself for 10 minutes. 5 minutes to model, 5 minutes for them to find a spot where they can apply it and report out in their groups. And then you want to release responsibility and let the kids try it out. As the English say, have a go. And so here's a teacher working with a child developing a PowerPoint. And she's going through and trying to make sure that she has used phrases in her PowerPoint, because what she's actually going to do on this particular PowerPoint, which I think was on the ocean, she's going to go through and narrate her PowerPoint so that it can show what she has learned. So there's a lot of digital literacy going on here, and the teacher at this point is just observing what she's doing. We probably should teach our kids the basic proofreader's marks. And for some of us, that backwards P didn't mean indent at all, it just meant new paragraph. So teaching these very basic one, the carets, the indenting for a new paragraph, beginning a new paragraph, inserting a comma, inserting quotes, the period, which will confuse a lot of kids because they've been using a caret with a period. We might as well teach them the actual proofreader's marks that people use because it will be helpful to them. Now, I wouldn't teach them all at once. I would teach them a couple of things so that they could begin to use it. If kids have been writing on the computer, you might then have them double space, print out their work, and then apply some of these marks. It will make it just much clearer and much more efficient for them in terms of what they're supposed to do when they are working on improving their piece of writing. Giving kids opportunities to publish really is important. And here's an example of a Stableless book that you can get again on Read, Think, Write, the IRA NCTE website. But there are many frames, and you can print the book. In this case, the child Jared inserted a picture of what it looked like being outside, change that picture into a black and white and put it in there, and you can print it out. Or what you can do is you can capture it using ScreenFlow, and they can actually read what they've read and then publish a book. There are many opportunities to publish. We know from Elbow's work and from Donald Graves' work that it's really important that children see their writing, that other people are appreciating it and valuing their writing. So this is just an example of something that you can find online to use with your kids very effectively. So here's how composing should change teaching. In many classrooms, teaching is taught very much the way it was when I was a kid. It's assigned. It's not actually taught. The first thing that should happen is that teachers should be really focused on keeping abreast of the Web 2.0 tools, and you're doing that through Diigo. Always looking for things that work, asking other teachers, attending conferences, getting on boards where people are discussing and chatting, chat rooms about writing and composing online and digital tools, asking people around you what they use and what works. I think probably the second thing that should happen is that teachers have to embrace that writing in the traditional way changes when you think about composing. It's not as linear. That is, there isn't a clear beginning, middle, and end. Kids may start at different points. They may start with the visual image or the video before they start with the writing, although most often they'll still have to do the same pre-planning if it's going to be highly effective. And the results are going to be different. Not everybody's piece is going to look the same, and that's okay. It makes lots of teachers uncomfortable, particularly if they have a rubric that's very narrow in focus. I think there's going to have to be a lot of modeling of tools. That means both teachers and kids are going to have to share with others how they did something and how it works. So that means there are going to be many experts in Web 2.0 tools within the classroom. That doesn't deny your importance as the teacher in terms of what's acceptable, your importance in terms of teaching kids how to be civil and respectful and the lines that they can't cross. But it does mean that you're going to have to value kids and be comfortable that that line is somewhat blurred between teacher and learner at different points. And finally, I think we're going to have to reward risk-taking. Really encourage those kids who think outside the box, who try something different, because that's really the only way that they're going to really be prepared to effectively interact in the digital community. So I hope this is helpful to you. Thank you very much.